Hi everybody, hopefully you watched the first video, but this is the second part to the Graves family goes camping. And we're right at the part where they discover the dragon ate the last Jumjo.
Oh dear, Mrs. Graves gasped. I understand someone left one single Jumjo behind, and it looks like whatever this creature has ate it, but you all know what that means. It will be back for more, everyone said in unison. At exactly that moment, a dark shadow hovered above them. Then something swooped down out of the sky and landed with a watery crash that felled trees and swamped the shoreline. A horrifying screech came from it. A puff of acrid smoke and a plume of fire and brimstone arched from its mouth and burned a small thicket of trees to the ground. Mrs. Graves pulled the children into the trailer. Wait! Dr. Graves shouted as he picked up a piece of his scientific equipment. My languageator. Let's see, he said as he fiddled with levers and buttons. I'll set the base tongue at lizard and Komodo dragon and hope that is close to its own language. Then Dr. Graves set the machine on project, lifted the announcing cone to his lips, and called out a friendly greeting. The translanguageator whirred and popped, and a sound rippled over the surface of the water and made trees flutter. The creature cocked its head, narrowed its eyes, and leaned close to the translanguageator, sniffing and snorting a puff of smoke. What does it want? Mrs. Graves called out from the trailer. Dr. Graves asked that very question into the projecting cone, then flipped a couple of switches. A strange sound came out of the machine that seemed to startle the creature. It came closer and bellowed back into the machine. Dr. Graves flipped a couple of switches, and a booming voice screamed, Food! It wasn't long before the Graves realized that the creature was interested in only one kind of food, Jumjills. In the next days, while Mrs. Graves, Phoebe, and the children shoveled Jumjills into the dragon as quickly as they could make them, Dr. Graves learned that the creature was the last of its kind, that it was a female, and that it was lonely. They also soon discovered that its appetite for Jumjills was impossible to fill, and that they were going to run out of supplies. Then what, they wondered. We have to get back to Union City, Mrs. Graves cried after a full day of the feeding frenzy. Bill and Nancy must be sick with worry, and 4th of July Spectacular is only 2 days away. I've a plan, Levy. After the dragon's evening meal of Jumjills, we'll break camp, drive up to the escarpment tunnel, and leave, Dr. Graves whispered to his wife. That evening, after the dragon flew off, the Graves family did exactly that, but when they got to the escarpment tunnel, the dragon was there waiting for them. It shrieked and spewed flames at the car, and stomped its feet so hard that it collapsed the tunnel, sealing them all into the valley. Now there was no escape route. But Mrs. Graves was angry. The next morning, Mrs. Graves was waiting for the creature. When it landed, she scolded into the translanguageator. It would seem to me that you would need to learn some manners. You make friends by being a friend, not holding people captive against their wills. You have frightened the children. Furthermore, any polite guest notes when offered a basket of Jumjills, a guest only takes one. And now you've trapped us here. Mrs. Graves broke down and cried. The dragon fluttered its eyes. Looking sheepish, it sniffed the basket of Jumjills. Then it flew off, this time disappearing into the horizon. All night Dr. Graves was frantic. They had run out of food and supplies. He hadn't allowed cell phones on vacation, and they wouldn't have worked here anyway. They were trapped, and he was worried. What would happen when the dragon realized there were no more Jumjills? It was that moment when Dr. Graves noticed that the Quebec Island seemed to be floating right toward the shore where he was sitting. With a giant whoosh, it beached itself. It was only then that Dr. Graves noticed that it wasn't an island at all. It appeared to be a very large boat. He set the entire family to pulling vines and brush off the boat, and that's when he saw it silhouetted in the moonlight. It was the Queen of Michigan. Now he remembered a legend he had forgotten, that once there was a canal that connected this lake to streams and rivers and finally to the Great Lakes themselves. The Queen of Michigan had navigated that canal until the night of the big summer storm nearly 100 years before. That night, the river boat had disappeared and had never been seen again, nor had the canal. "Lovey, it's our way out," Dr. Graves exclaimed to Mrs. Graves. "Pack up the camp, drive the car and trailer onto the deck, and I'll look for a way to get the Queen's engines to run again." Dr. Graves filled the water tanks and got the children to help him gather wood to stoke up the fires and get the boilers steaming. Then he dropped a small tablet into each water tank. "My own invention. It may give us a little boost when we need it," he said proudly. When everyone was aboard, Seth stroked the fires, Sarah pulled the steam valves, and Mrs. Graves steered while Dr. Graves freed the stern wheel. Then he and Ronnie read the ancient map. According to this map, the entrance to the old canal is right about there. He pointed at a mound of suspiciously tangled roots along the shore, not far from where they had camped. "Full steam ahead," he shouted, pointing at the spot. With that, they got a full head of steam, and Mrs. Graves ran straight into what looked like the banks of Lake Bleakmire. They spent a whole night navigating the canal, streams, rivers, and finally a lake. Dr. Graves announced it was Union Lake, and their beloved Union City was dead ahead. The river boat bumped into shore at Shirt Tail Flutter just across the St. Joe River from the football field where the fireworks show was going to happen in 2 short days. Ronnie looked up. "It looks like rain." "Don't even think about it, son," Dr. Graves said. "But what if it did rain? The fireworks would get wet, and that would be a disaster, wouldn't it?" "Yes, but it's not going to happen. Trust me," yawned Dr. Graves. Exhausted from the night of travel, they drove the car and trailer home and collapsed in their beds. On the 4th of July, Dr. and Mrs. Graves awoke to a commotion in their living room. "Mom, Dad," Ronnie was shouting, "it's the dragon! She followed us here. She's on the river next to the river boat right across from the football field." "Jum Jills," both Dr. and Mr. Graves said. "Doug, if that creature burns down the town with her breath, we most certainly will no longer be welcome in Union City," Mrs. Graves sobbed. But Dr. Graves was tapping his head. "Lovey, you best get busy making Jum Jills. It will buy time until I think what to do." When they got to the river, the dragon had already pitched a temper tantrum, burned down a small clump of trees, and thrashed about in the river so much that she had swamped the football field with water and soaked the fireworks. "Naughty, naughty," Dr. Graves scolded the dragon. It cowered low to the riverbank and looked sheepish. "I'll bring you some Jum Jills later tonight. You'll just have to wait." Dr. Graves spent most of the day racking his brain for a solution to the dragon problem. Not to mention, how was he going to tell the whole town that the fireworks weren't happening? "Here is the first basket of Jum Jills, dear," Mrs. Graves said when she had made her first batch. Luckily, Phoebe had helped. "Don't worry, people will understand about the fireworks." Dr. Graves stared at the basket of Jum Jills for a moment. Then he smiled wryly and took them to his laboratory in the basement. In a few moments he came back upstairs humming, and made his way to the riverbank where he left the basket of gem-jills. That evening, the Union City High School football field was filled to capacity. As Dr. Graves climbed the steps to the platform, cameras crackled and people cheered. But as he stepped up to the microphone, he had a heavy heart. Clearly, his plan hadn't worked. But just as he opened his mouth to announce that there would be no fireworks this year, something started to happen down on the riverbank across from the football field. The ground rumbled and shook. Then there was an explosion of such monumental proportion that windows rattled in their panes as far away as Mackinac Island. Then dazzling color shot into the night sky. The crowd oohed and awed. Then there was a gargantuan, catastrophic burp that was so loud it shattered places clear over in cold water. More light and color catapulted up, up, up into the stratosphere. The lights were seen as far away as Mississippi. Then a large balloon-looking thing darted around the sky, this way and that, with plumes of flame and fireworks shooting out of it. Ronnie, Sarah, and Seth looked very carefully at the balloon. It was the dragon. It was wheezing and coughing flames and fireworks. It shot straight up with a belch, swooping down with a cough, and spiraled sideways with its stomach grumbling fiery puffs of rockets and color. Oh my, it was spectacular. Well, sir, that 4th of July was legendary, all right. That single night put Union City right up there with New York and Chicago in the annals of pyrotechnic displays. And there was no need at all for anyone to know that Dr. Graves had sprinkled his new and experimental firepower into those gem-jills that night. Of course, not a citizen, with the exception of the Graves and Miller families, would even learn of the dragon's existence. From that time on, she was content to stay quietly hidden in the marshes at Shirt Tail Flutter, next to the football field on the river. On some nights, she was happy to take the Graves family, including Phoebe, of course, out for a midnight flight on her leathery back. They had become quite good friends. They named her Barbara. Of course, Mrs. Graves visited Barbara every morning and brought her a basket of gem-jills. But she had learned her lesson. From that time on, she took only one gem-jill, at least only one at a time. The end.